Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Seekers Forum talk. We're going to be discussing abundance in spiritual life. Now that spring is here, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, we see the rebirth of new life all around us. As we come out of the dark season and nature turns the world green once again, we're reminded to be abundant in our own lives as well, self-renewing, plentiful, as well as creative. And yet, as welcome as the springtime may be, there's another quality to this season as well. There's a kind of poignancy, even a certain type of pain in watching life emerge from what seems to be dead. You may remember T.S. Eliot's great opening lines of his poem, The Wasteland. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. From the comforting darkness of winter, we, like all other living things, are called back into the sun. But unlike flowering plants, for example, that turn automatically toward the light, there's something in human nature that resists this turning as well, that prefers to stay buried and out of sight. Even though we respond immediately to the light, this shadow-loving part of the mind fights it off at the same time very often. And this resistance to our own flowering and the abundance that lies at our core is a great problem for contradictory creatures such as ourselves. There are times, as all of you know, when we deliberately avoid what we need and deprive ourselves of our soul's desires. But why do we block our own abundance? Why does a part of us fight off renewal and prefer to stay in the cold and in the dark? How can abundance and generosity and openness and fullness become the foundation of our spiritual life? That's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's start with the riddle of ambivalence. Ambivalence. The experience of feeling pulled in two directions at once, at odds with ourselves, is a universal human trait. Although we tell ourselves that we want freedom and power and plenty in our lives, this is actually only half true. Given the choice to maintain the status quo or risk change, a lot of us opt for faithfulness to the familiar, even when it imprisons us. When we're presented with the opportunity to leave what's dead and gone behind us and to move forward toward what's alive and growing, we frequently demur and say, well, maybe not quite yet. Even when the known is intolerable, we often prefer it to the fear of the unknown. You remember what the novelist Dostoevsky described human beings as being the animals that can adapt to anything. Well, this genius for adaptation is actually both a blessing and a curse. To the adaptive part of the psyche, the devils that we know seem much less antagonistic and scary. We tell ourselves stories to justify our fears. It's not the right time for change. The risks don't guarantee the reward. We're really just fine the way we are. Besides, we tell ourselves life is a veil of tears and we can't expect it to get much better anyway. These are some of the messages that we use to tamp down our own unhappiness, because ambivalence is a pessimist that defends its entrenchment with fear. Okay? But nature herself is not ambivalent. Nowhere in creation are you going to find a species that can't decide if it should grow or not. Given the opportunity to flourish, no plant or animal other than us will stop itself because it's just not sure if it's worth the effort. When there's light and space to expand, every sentient being, aside from humans, seizes the opportunity to be fruitful and to multiply. Not to do so would be unnatural. It would be a refusal of the gift of life. And yet, as complicated, divided creatures, we prefer very often to live unnaturally, diverted by our shoulds and our oughts, and I don't deserve it, or I deserve more than is being offered, so why even bother? We project our negative expectations onto the unknown and turn ourselves into beggars at the feast of life. You must know the great line from Auntie Mame: life is a banquet, but most poor sons of bitches are starving to death. And that's because we're waiting for someone to feed us, or someone to convince us that it's okay to eat, or we're waiting for a detailed list of ingredients in the meal, lest we, God forbid, bite into something that we don't like. We're overly cautious in the face of the abundance of life and peck at our plates kind of half-heartedly. We don't trust our legitimate place at the table, and we don't always trust our ability to feed ourselves. Nor do we necessarily have confidence in the cook in the kitchen, that life force that created us, that laid out this spread for us in the first place and wants us to eat to our heart's content. We don't trust. So, how is it possible to open to the abundance of life without fear? Well, there are three primary types of fear associated with the unwillingness or inability to thrive. The first is the fear of overindulgence. The second is the fear of being overwhelmed. And the third is the fear of disappointment. Now, of these three kinds of fears, the fear of disappointment is actually the most pernicious. The preemptive curbing of our life force out of fear that we'll disappoint ourselves or be disappointed by others. This terror of disappointment actually feeds ambivalence, and it scares us away from so many things that we aspire to, whether it's love or creative exploration or freedom in its many forms. Rather than allow ourselves to bloom as nature intended, we strangle ourselves in the bud, and we take on the low-grade unhappiness that often comes from blocking our own vitality. As the French author Anais Nin wrote, quote, "And the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom." Isn't that great? And the day came when the risk to remain tight in the bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. That's the line that we walk in our lives between two different kinds of pain: the pain that comes from growing and the pain that comes from staying closed. The quality of our existence actually depends on which form of pain we choose. When we opt for the discomfort of growing, we discover that once we're through the initial difficulty, we're more than compensated for our trouble by the satisfaction of stretching our limits and breaking new ground and opening to our potential. This urge to grow is in our biological, psychological, as well as our spiritual constitution. It's why human beings care about going to the moon and care about decoding the genome and connecting all living things on the planet by way of digital intelligence, because we're made for metamorphosis. It's our mandate as a species. Just as spiders spin webs and beavers build dams, and ants create colonies of astonishing complexity and dimension, human beings are born to transcend our limits and wake up to our own true nature by understanding how our minds work and removing the obstacles to self-realization. That's our mandate as a species. And the fact that we struggle in this process is not a sign of failure. The only failure, quote unquote, comes from turning away and saying no to our potential and yes to the fear of this abundance. I gave a talk in the Seekers Forum a couple of years ago called The Fruitful Darkness. And that wasn't just a pretty turn of phrase, because in fact, much of our treasure is found in the dark. Our greatest riches frequently lie buried in unconsciousness. And that's why we do the hard work of self-inquiry, tilling the soil of our personality to uncover what lies beneath the surface. This is painful work, sometimes, but there is no growth without it. Just as a person can't begin to strengthen a torn muscle until the tear itself is healed, She can't strengthen her mind and intention until she finds out where it's fractured. That requires attention and care and patience and practice. In spiritual growth, just as in emotional and physical progress, there's no skipping. There are no skipping steps by bypassing the things in us that need healing. Let me just tell you about a student of mine. I'll call her Sherry. Sherry is a highly capable, successful businesswoman in her late 40s. From the outside, she appears to have a very full life with a career and health, financial security, a loving family, and so on. But Sherry has actually been secretly depressed for many years. She's been haunted by the sense that she's missing out on much of what her life has to offer. Outwardly, she's a model of optimism and spiritual wisdom. And she sings the praises of God and pretends to be at peace with who she is. When negative feelings and thoughts assail her, she tries to drown them out with platitudes. Rather than allow her grief and frustrations and confusion to surface, Sherry denies them, even to herself, and believes, as many seekers are taught to believe, that these difficult personal human problems aren't important and not worth indulging in. To be spiritual, she thinks, means to be light and joyful, and the rest is just better left unfelt and unsaid. Sherry can't understand why, with all of her blessings and a spiritual practice that is supposed to uplift her, she has such a hard time feeling pleasure or satisfaction. It's as if the abundance of life is beyond her reach, with her smiley face mask in place. I had this sense when we met and when she told me about what was going on, that until she took off this mask and let herself frown, nothing was going to change for Sherry, because she was caught in what is known as spiritual bypassing, which many of you are familiar with. Focusing on the light, the positive, the quote unquote divine, in hopes that the darkness will just disappear. What Sherry didn't understand is that until she emptied her emotional cup of everything that she was resisting, she wouldn't be able to take in anything new. So I encouraged her to spill her darker feelings and thoughts on the page and challenge this false idea that being spiritual means feeling no pain or confusion or ambivalence or fear. At first, Sherry was very resistant to this and to venturing into the shadows. She'd survived a dark, very dark childhood. And she was scared of being sucked backward in time, regressing on the spiritual path. But in fact, the opposite happened. At first, she went through some hard weeks of writing about old emotions and feeling victimized and angry and sad. She wrote about these residual wounds and did more crying, Sherry told me, in 1 month than she had done in the past 10 years. But instead of trapping her in these feelings, giving herself permission to grieve actually helped to empty her emotional glass and free up room for Sherry to experience new things. As she moved through these shadows, her sense of lightness grew more intense. Because she allowed herself to be vulnerable, she was finally able to feel the abundance that had eluded her behind her smiley face mask. And by the end of our work together, Sherry was feeling more authentic and free and contradictory, in other words, more human than she had in a very, very long time. She recognized that her spiritual bypassing, she saw it for what it was. And she vowed not to fall back on old habits of hiding the truth underneath her idealism. So ask yourself, are you able to open to the abundance of your existence? Are you comfortable feeling the intense complexity of what it means to be alive? What would it take for you to empty your emotional cup, to make room for the richness of life to enter? Do you get seduced by negative feelings? Or do you succumb to the opposite tendency of leapfrogging the shadow in hopes of enlightenment? Ask yourself, how and when do you muffle your joy and shrink into feelings of scarcity? Do you feel worthy of having an abundant life? These are excellent questions to explore as you're looking at where you want to effloresce, where you want to expand, where you want to grow. When we talk about awakening to our life, that's what we're referring to. Opening to our full dimension and learning to tolerate our own greatness. By greatness, I don't mean worldly standing or outward achievements, but rather the enormous potential for wisdom and creativity and growth that's our human birthright. That's what I mean by greatness. That freedom is intimidating as well as inspiring because it calls on us to take responsibility for our choices and stop blaming other people or circumstances for our limitations. It means facing our own ambivalence and the part of us that would rather play small and nibble at life instead of eating with gusto, and lament all the things that we don't possess instead of savoring all that is available to us. Complaining is a lot easier than having courage, and so is moaning over the half-empty glass instead of looking more closely and seeing that, in fact, the glass is overflowing and that the lack of abundance was in the eye of the beholder. That shift from scarcity to plenitude is parallel to the shift from fear to love. Together, they raise our sights from materialism that's always decreasing in value to spirituality that is increasing in value moment by moment, immune to the restrictions of fear. So let's just recap for a second. The first point is our nature is to be abundant. Okay, our natural self, our true identity is as an abundant, self-creative, and self-reinventing gesture of the divine. Our nature is to be abundant. The second point is that we are ambivalent very often toward our own blossoming. We're ambivalent, and that ambivalent keeps us stuck in our tracks. The third point is that given the opportunity to thrive, we often say, not yet. Not yet. I want to thrive, I want to prosper, I want to taste life's fullness, but maybe not quite yet. The next point is that we can adapt either up or down. Okay, adaptation is a mixed bag. It's a blessing and a curse. So ask yourself, what are you adapting to? And are you adapting to things you'd rather not adapt to, that you'd rather feel the pain of and move beyond? The next point is that there is no virtue in being a beggar at the banquet. Despite what we're taught by moralistic codes of conduct, including certain religions, and ideas that we inherit about false humility and false modesty, there really is no virtue in playing small and in staying hungry at the banquet. That isn't a spiritually superior position. In fact, it's a position that misses out on the joy of spiritual practice and the spiritual approach to life. The next point is that fear of indulgence and fear of disappointment block us in different ways. And it's good to look at where the fears are and what is actually holding us back. Because this fear of disappointment is profound and far-reaching. It's what is behind the whole idea of sour grapes, of course. The next point is that we live our lives between two forms of pain, the pain of growing and the pain of staying closed. If you don't like the word pain, you can use the word discomfort. We have these two directions of discomfort. The one is it leads us toward, is constructive and growthful and transformative, and the other one is tight and small and anti-life. Okay, it's saying, no, I will not open. So choosing which form of discomfort we prefer in our lives has everything to do with the quality of our existence and our attitude and our trust in our own potential to choose and to change. The next thing to look at is that the darkness is fruitful and it's ripe for exploring. So while there are monsters in the shadows, there are also our greatest attributes and depth of awareness that we can't have access to unless we're willing to go through difficulty and go through the things that are in the way. Next, we can't feel joy until we grieve. We can't feel joy until we grieve. We can't feel abundance until we are willing to acknowledge our losses. This is yet another paradox. We're always talking about paradox in the Seeker's Forum, and this is a central paradox to our human nature. That our ability to feel joy and abundance is in proportion to our ability to feel grief and loss. And finally, spiritual bypassing makes self-realization an impossibility. Okay, there is no self-realization or self-actualization through spiritual bypassing. You can't get to dessert without eating the meal. So notice in your life where you may be using spiritual bypassing to avoid things that cause you discomfort, things you need to look at, and how that spiritual bypassing actually prevents you from tasting the fullness of your own life and engaging as deeply as you would like to. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about the abundance of spiritual life. And now, Jay, why don't we open up the lines? And I'd like to pose a question and ask folks, are you aware in your own life of ways that you may avoid abundance, that you may avoid what's actually possible for you? And how do you do that? And why do you do that?